Hey friends, welcome back to Hugehead Studio. My name is Robbie, and this week I wanted to sculpt a villain whose arch nemesis is basically just a giant shirtless dude with a Lord Farquaad haircut. So naturally I'm talking about the one and only Skeletor. You know, the big baddie from Masters of the Universe. Blue body, super jacked, and a skull for a face. You know, kind of like Sylvester Stallone, where you're like, hey, this guy's pretty fit, and then you see the face and you're like, what the hell is that? Then you got He-Man over there with them simple man eyes and those aggressively black eyebrows, like a mix between Will Poulter and Amanda Bynes post-Crash Out. Anyway, the original 80s Masters of the Universe cartoon was a little before my time, but I did catch a few episodes growing up in the late 90s, and I mostly just remember all the voices being completely ridiculous. My intro to the show was around the same time Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was big, so every time He-Man spoke, I couldn't help but think he just sounded like a dramatic Regis Philbin. And Skeletor sounded like the angry Frenchman from Monty Python, which was odd. Like, seriously, what was that? I mean, don't get me wrong, the new Skeletor sounds totally stupid as well, but the original Skeletor's voice was so high-pitched and whiny, it didn't fit the look at all. Like a German Shepherd with the bark of a Chihuahua. But honestly, I kinda like the whiny voice. It's definitely better than the 2026 version. Skeletor in the previews for the new movie sounds like a weirder version of Tom Hardy's Bane, while the whiny OG voice adds to the ridiculousness of the whole show, which in my limited experience is completely ridiculous. Though I'm no Masters of the Universe superfan, and I'm going off memories of a show I only watched a handful of times almost 30 years ago. Jesus, I just made myself feel old. Anyway, from what I remember, the series felt kinda all over the place, but in the best way possible. Like, one minute it's barbarians swinging axes, and then the next it's laser guns and 80s sci-fi chaos. Kinda like someone dropped a handful of heavy metal album covers and a box of action figures into a blender and then decided for some reason everybody had to wear a loincloth. And then you just got He-Man and Skeletor constantly throwing shade at everyone for no reason. It's really dumb and really entertaining. So for this project I went back and forth between deciding to sculpt He-Man or Skeletor. But I didn't think I had the willpower to sculpt that He-Man haircut without just turning him into a full-blown Lord Farquaad mashup. I also really struggled to look at He-Man without getting the urge to sing the ridiculous version of that For Non-Blonde song, and I really didn't want that earworm. Which, by the way, didn't matter in the long run because that song's been stuck in my head for days, but ultimately I decided to go with Skeletor. For this Skeletor sculpt, I decided to go with kind of a basic action figure pose, but with one arm bent with a clenched fist while the other holds his staff. My focus on this project is a little more practice with this overbuilt superhero-esque anatomy with special attention paid to the quads as a muscle group I don't sculpt or paint very often. Another focus will be on the feet as I continue to try to break out of my comfort zone of just making little round sausage feet and pretending no one pays attention. Then finally, the most obvious focus will be on his skull face as I'm used to making faces with the muscle and the tissue and skin actually still attached, so making a bare but expressive skull face will be interesting. But in the meantime, I'm working on Skeletor's midsection, which isn't a waste of time because it totally won't be almost completely covered by the harness I dress him with later on. Planning ahead is totally overrated, am I right? Like, what even is a sketchbook? Once I get the core nice and jacked, I'm ready to move on to my middle focus and pay more attention to the feet, which is a nice little baby step with Skeletor as he wears some pointy boots that I can detail a little easier than my normal clay blobs that I call shoes, but they're still pretty simple in the grand scheme of things. I mean, of course there are versions of Skeletor with some big-ass dinosaur-looking feet, but I wasn't feeling those at all, so cowboy pimp boots it is. Actually, they look like Wonder Woman's boots. Once the feet are complete, I'm ready to move on to his loincloth thing, and then I realized that with my Kratos and Darth Maul and now this guy, that's like 3 out of the last 5 sculpts I've made that include a loincloth or a kilt of some kind. Then add my Mojo Jojo and Black Knight on top of that, and I realize I make a lot of characters wearing man dresses. Wonder if I subconsciously want to wear a kilt. Nah, I'm shaped like a pit bull, so I doubt I could pull it off. Still though, I bet a kilt during summer here in Michigan would be pretty amazing. Anyway, I continue on with adding all the little elements of Skeletor's outfit, shooting for the look from the original cartoon, though I will take a few artistic liberties here and there with paint. Once the body is done, I move on to the head, starting with a big old ball of Super Sculpey. Usually I'd wrap this around a ball of aluminum foil to reduce the mass, but I'm going to be digging out the holes for the eyes and all that, and it'll just be easier to carve away at a ball of solid clay without having to worry about bottoming out on the aluminum. Then I kinda built this skull backwards from how I probably should have, because out of habit I started structuring the head the same way I always do when building the base for my characters. Only problem there is most of my characters actually have faces, not just a skull. So instead of building on top of the facial structure, I basically had to carve through the face to find the skull underneath. So I'm doing a combination of additive and subtractive sculpture, but at this stage I'm doing way more subtractive sculpture than I normally do. If you don't know the difference between the two, and if you're wondering why I'm talking about math while sculpting a Skeletor face, then let me learn you something real quick about additive and subtractive sculpture. They are basically exactly what they sound like. Additive is when you build forms up by adding material like stacking and shaping clay into existence. Ceramic pottery and pretty much all the little clay sculptures I typically make. Subtractive sculpting, on the other hand, is when you remove material to reveal the form hidden inside, like carving a shape out of a solid block. So a lot of the old marble sculptures you see in art history, like the Pietà or Greek and Roman architectural reliefs, are typically subtractive. There you go. Fun fact of the day. Anyway, once I got the face all built up, I smoothed out all the edges as much as I could before throwing the head back on the body to check the proportions. Then, to get started on his hood, I wrapped a strip of clay around the face, making him look like an expired babushka before finishing the rest of the hood off camera because it was much harder to make than anticipated. Nobody wanted to watch me ride that struggle bus. Then I added a few more elements to shape the hood to look more like Skeletor's and less like B-Rabbit, and then did my best to smooth it all out and blend the seams without accidentally tearing the hood apart. With the head done, all that's left to sculpt is the staff, which according to the Google is called the Havoc staff, and it does all kinds of nerdy stuff. For the ram skull on top of the staff, I decided to follow suit with the rest of the sculpt and go for the look of the ram skull from the OG cartoon. I'd say it's for artistic purposes, but realistically I looked at a real ram skull and decided I did not currently have the attention span for all of that. I mean, I could probably make a realistic ram skull well enough to pass, because the secret to doing anything is believing that you can do it. But I'm excusing my laziness on this one by convincing myself the stylized version would fit the rest of the sculpt just fine. With the staff done, we are ready to paint. But first, check this out. Oh boy, is that satisfying. Anyway, moving on, I airbrushed on a dark base coat over the whole sculpt and then got started laying in a base layer for the blue skin when my big sausage fingers snapped off one of the flaps for his man skirt, which is wonderful. But don't worry, I managed to snap off 3 more by the time I finished working on the skin, so yay me. To build up some depth in the muscles, I used the same technique as I did when painting the green skin on my turtles from my Middle-Aged Mutant Ninja Turtle series. I'm using acrylics, which dry pretty quick, so they don't blend quite as easily as oils. But my method is to brush on a strip or a dot of wet paint and then use a mop brush to poke and dab and pull at the paint until the edges are nice and feathered. Then I let that layer dry fully. Otherwise, you run the risk of lifting that layer off the surface if you go at it with the next layer too soon before it's dry, and you just don't want that. But once it does dry, then repeat the process over and over with slightly lighter hues of blue until I have a nice gradient built up that breaks up the flat color and helps push the depth and makes the skin feel slightly more believable. Once the skin is done, I then use the power of super glue to fix the carnage from my fat fingers and then carefully reattach all the little flap thingies one by one so I can get to work painting his clothes. First, I'll lay in a base coat of purple on all the clothes that are purple. Real wordsmith there. I used some glossy paints to mix up this purple because I figured the skirt and the harness would probably be pretty leathery. But looking back, I wish I'd thought to use a flatter mix for his hood because it's super glossy and I'm just not a fan of a lot of gloss. I then added a base coat for all of the bone elements in the sculpt. The OG cartoon Skeletor has a yellowish green hue to it, so I kinda pushed the color a little in that direction, but not too much, as I guess I preferred to make it lean more towards a traditional bone color rather than the weird green. Then added some shadows to break up the flat color and imply more depth, just like with the muscles. I added a lighter mix of this bone color to the high points to push the highlights even further and give it just a little more color variation. Once the face was done, I moved back to the purple flats and started layering in some darker purple shadows using the same method I used on the muscles with the mop brush, dabbing at the paint to feather the edges. I then did the same in the other direction using a lighter mix of the purple to push the highlights, again brushing on a glob of wet paint and then dabbing at it with my mop brush to blend it in and create a nice gradient. After that, I painted the red gem thing on his chest that I'm assuming is an important element to the character, but I don't remember what it is, and then I cured it with a bit of UV resin to make it shiny. With that done, all that's left to do is to finish up the ram skull for the staff. So I followed the same exact steps I used on the face to break up the flat color and accent the contours of the shape with the highlights and lowlights. I then painted a grayish, beigeish, brownish color onto the horns to help them stand out from the rest of the skull, and then added a few darks and lights here and there in a sad attempt to give it some variation as well. And with that, Skeletor is all done and he's ready to go sit on my shelf and talk smack to all of my other little sculptures. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little project. If you did, do me a favor and like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you didn't, then I'm honestly just impressed that you're still here. But subscribe to the channel if you like it and hit that notification bell to make sure you don't miss out on the next project. I think we'll head back to the dungeon to make a certain screaming goat and a certain severed doll head to go along with Carl and Donut. But that about does it for now, so as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.